So very recently, I found out that The Shining has a sequel, like a week ago. I saw a post on Twitter, someone sharing how much they loved the casting of this character. And it was Wendy Torrance, but it wasn't Shelley Duvall. So I thought like maybe it was like AI or like a meme or something, I really didn't know. But then I noticed that the clapper actually had the name Dr. Sleep on it in the shot. It was like a behind the scenes shot. And I was like, huh, Dr. Sleep. I wonder, maybe that's like a Hearts of Darkness, like a documentary about the making of The Shining kind of thing, right? And no, it's just a straight up direct sequel to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining.
But the things that live there.
Hello, Danny.
They come back.
And I was shocked. I mean, it's The Shining. I think that the sequel would be something that I would know about, that is super popular, or at least well talked about at some point, but I never once heard about this movie, and it came out in 2018. And so the first thought in my mind was the same thought that you're probably having if this is the first time you're seeing it too. Is it even worth watching? Welcome to KenoKino. My name's Keno. I'm going to answer that question for you right now, because today we're talking about Mike Flanagan's Dr. Sleep.
Come and play with us forever and ever.
So like I said, I looked it up, I saw the poster, and the first thing that came to my mind was,
That's Obi-Wan Kenobi.
so we're starting off on the right foot. No, but seriously, how does a classic like The Shining have a direct sequel that isn't even remotely talked about? Or at least not nearly as much as The Shining? Well, I think the first and most likely reason has to do with the director, because it's not Stanley Kubrick. Doing sequels with different directors is something that very, very, very rarely goes well. I mean, even if they have a good director, it's very hard to live up to the predecessor and to have that same feeling, the same essence, but also capture the audience of a very well-known director like Kubrick. It'd be like if tomorrow they announced that Pulp Fiction 2: Pulp Harder is directed by Taika Waititi. I mean, even if he pulled off a good film, if it's not amazing, if it doesn't have the Tarantino stamp of approval, and if it doesn't capture the same essence of the first film, it's not going to be a success. Now, luckily for Dr. Sleep, The Shining was not made by Kubrick. The Shining is Stephen King's story, and this film does have the Stephen King stamp of approval.
Mike's movie stands on its own, as its own thing, and it has its own excitement and its own rewards. And I don't know about anybody else, how anybody's going to feel about it, but for me, it was great to go back to the Overlook.
Now, Stephen King being part of the project is very great for Stephen King fans, but the thing with The Shining is that it very specifically is divided into two camps, the Stephen King fans and the Stanley Kubrick fans, and they don't really have too much mingle. And it's not helped at all by the fact that Stephen King really dislikes The Shining film.
No, the book was warm and the movie was cold. It was a Kubrick film. And don't get me wrong, I love everything else the man did. I just didn't like that one.
And if that isn't complicated enough, wait till you hear that Dr. Sleep is a direct sequel to Kubrick's Shining, not Stephen King's. Now, maybe you don't know, but Kubrick's Shining actually has different story elements than Stephen King's. You know, that's a big reason why he wasn't a fan of it. Now, I'm not going to talk about spoilers, so don't worry about that, but the two stories have different story beats in specific places, and relatively decent-sized story beats. It's not like the whole story is changed or anything, but different elements, for sure, are different, obviously. And somehow the director Mike Flanagan convinced Stephen King that they should do the movie based off of Kubrick's The Shining, because he said that the audience would relate more to that, that's the one they know better, as opposed to his book and his TV series, which, hot damn, if I was Stephen King, I'd feel a little burned, you know? Now, the movie Dr. Sleep came out in 2018, but Stephen King did write his own book, Dr. Sleep, that came out in 2013. I don't know anything about that, don't ask me. But I'd imagine it's different from the movie in terms of the Kubrick story elements. So as you can see, hot off the presses, the film is a real mess when trying to figure out who it's made for, you know? It feels like they're stretching themselves very, very thin, trying to capture as wide of a net as they could. Now, even after all that mess, they actually managed to do a nice job. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not going to be lauded over for years to come or become a classic or anything like that, but I can say they definitely did a decent job trying to capture both audiences here. Now, like I said, they had a nice blend, but you can definitely see how this film's going to be way more favorable in a King's fan's eyes than a Kubrick's. So to answer your burning question, I would say that if you're a Stephen King fan or someone who really wanted to go more in depth in the Shining universe and the story with the characters, then Dr. Sleep's going to be a great experience for you through and through. I mean, the story is beat for beat what you expect from King and really explores what the Shining is on film for the very first time, and also talks about the people in the world that have it and the implications of people that may want to try and harvest it. And seeing where Danny has ended up after the events of the Overlook Hotel and what his life has become like as an adult, Well, it's very interesting, and it feels very realistic for a boy who's grown up into an adult with this traumatic experience and these feelings and this power that he has. For a Kubrick fan, the answer is a little more complicated. I feel confident in saying that the movie is a narrative sequel, but not a spiritual one, which is not normally how that goes. And what I mean by that is that Kubrick's Shining was led by atmosphere. The horror and dread you feel while watching the movie came before the narrative, really. I mean, you leave The Shining feeling very dark, with not many answers about The Shining, the hotel, or why the family was affected the way that they were. Now, I would say that Dr. Sleep is the complete opposite of that. Watching Dr. Sleep, you have 3 narratives that you follow that all collide together, each of them showing different aspects of The Shine, different creatures, and explores the universe of The Shining with a much more optimistic adventure. So if you're a Kubrick fan, I would say you definitely won't get the same atmosphere that you got from The Shining. I mean, they do their best to recreate it in certain areas, but even then, it definitely feels more like an imitation rather than a true recreation. But if you care about learning more about the world of The Shining, then I think you'll have a good time. I mean, it's got some good nostalgic beats for fans of The Shining, and like I said, it's very, very interesting to see what happens to Danny after the events of the Overlook. So if you're curious about that, well, you finally get to see it. What if you're not really in either group? Like if you just watched The Shining and you thought it was a good movie, and you just want to see what the sequel's like, if it's worth watching, but you don't really have any specific wants from the film. Well, let's talk about it. Now I'm going to do my best to avoid any major spoilers in the film or any hard spoilers, just to kind of give you an overall idea of what to expect. Now, Dr. Sleep does some things that I think work really well. I'm going to break them down into 3 categories. Structure. Now, the overall structure of the film is interesting. The movie starts by introducing a new character into the world who is set up to be a villain, but they're completely separate from Danny. Then after that scene, we see Danny in his young years, only a little after the events at the Overlook Hotel. And there we see how he tries to deal with things so soon after the events that happened to him. And then we're introduced into a new character years in the future that shines just like Danny does. And that's basically the core structure of the whole movie. We have 3 characters running parallel to one another that will intersect at a certain point in the movie. Now, this structure is one that you don't see very often, and it's very cool they tried to pull this off. And for the most part, they do. It allows for a lot to happen and a lot to be explained, and to be able to set up the characters as their own characters separate from one another, so that way when they all come together, you value them all. In different ways. You're not exactly rooting for the villain or anything, but when you watch the villain, you've gotten to learn what she's like and learn more things about her, so that way when they all come together, it has a lot more weight to it than if it was just seeing the villain at the end of the movie, or just kind of subtly getting glimpses here and there of the villain, and then finally getting them at the end. It really allows the collide to feel natural, where you have feelings about each character rather than only connecting with one or two. You get to see all of them in pretty much the same amount of screen time. But this structure also has some pitfalls. You can tell in the movie that some of the characters got a little more time and exploration given to them than others. Now, it doesn't necessarily affect the way you feel about the characters, but it does take away time from things that you probably want to see from other characters, things that you would think are pretty cool to see. It's got a pace that it's sticking to, and in an attempt to keep up that pace, they let some interesting story aspects fall to the wayside. Specifically for me, the one that I was bummed about was actually about Wendy. She really didn't have much of a large role in the film, and I feel like she really deserved it after everything she went through at the Overlook. I mean, all of the trauma and horrible events that happened to her, we really don't get to see how she's handled that, or exactly what happens to her in her day-to-day life. Now for category 2, let's talk story. Now, like I said, Dr. Sleep follows 3 different characters, and all 3 of those characters are in different points of their lives with very interesting backgrounds and motivations that you get to explore throughout the movie. Now, one is the main villain who's doing their best to keep their family fed and keep them strong. One is a new hero who's rising up and growing up faster than they should have to in order to defeat evil. And last, we have a survivor, someone who's had enough adventure for their lifetime and is struggling to just find a life to live after spending so many years only surviving. Now, all the characters are portrayed very well by the actors playing them and are very interesting to watch as they try to fulfill their motivations and deal with each other. Which brings me into one of my favorite aspects about them. None of them are dumb. I mean, they all have good ideas on how to solve their problems and do a pretty good job executing their plans. You never really look at their actions as confusing. More often than not, you're just kind of impressed. Either by the execution or the plan itself. Obviously, not everything works out all the time, but you're never really sitting there like, duh. More often than not, it's like, damn, that's crazy. Now, unfortunately, I can say pretty confidently that this movie had a plan. And since the movie didn't do well when it was released, I don't think we're ever going to see that plan come to fruition. And so there are sacrifices made on certain story aspects that now have no payoff because they'll never be able to execute their goal. And I'd say that's probably the story's biggest issue. Now, I would say the biggest decision they made in terms of difference from The Shining movie is that this movie does a lot of explaining compared to The Shining. I mean, don't get me wrong, they don't necessarily hit you over the head with answers or anything, but they definitely leave a lot less to the imagination than Kubrick's did. We learn how Danny deals with his shine, we learn about the villain's powers and secrets, we learn about the different kinds of shine in the world and what that means to the people and what they can and can't do. For me, I like answers. I enjoy when there are rules to a universe and I have fun imagining all the cool cool things that happen between those lines. But I definitely know that's not an opinion shared by everybody, so I would just say that's something to keep in mind if that's not an aspect of storytelling that you enjoy. And now for category number 3, the one aspect that every Stephen King story needs: the horror. Now, the horror of Dr. Sleep actually reminds me of Jordan Peele's Nope, where the horror is definitely there, but it actually is more of kind of an adventure rather than just a scary horror story. There aren't that many jump scares from what I remember, and they do a decent imitation of Kubrick's eerie feelings here and there when they try to. So I would say yes, there is horror to this movie, but it's not really horrifying. I mean, there's some gross monsters and some scary moments for sure, but I think I'd classify it more of like a horror adventure rather than just straight horror or scary movie. So in short, if you want a good horror/adventure movie, you got one. I mean, it's a nice movie to watch. It was nothing amazing, but to me it was worth a 2.5-hour runtime. Now, I'm speaking as someone who thought The Shining was cool, and I want to learn more about the world and those characters, and so for me it was really good to see. I mean, as far as movie sequels go, especially horror movie sequels, it could have been a lot worse. You know, as a little bonus take, I actually think that if you're a horror fan and you've been looking for a movie to get your kids into, like when they're kind of younger, you don't really want to scare them too badly, but you kind of want them to have fun and get into horror like you are, I would say Dr. Sleep actually isn't a bad place to start. I mean, if they watch it and they enjoy it and they have a good time, I think that later on, then once they grow up and realize that there's a prequel, then you show them The Shining, and I think it'll be pretty cool. So, yeah. I mean, it's just a fun horror adventure with a cool kid as the lead character. It's pretty sweet. Man, that guy really loves to talk, am I right? Well, anyways, that answers the questions, whether you're a King fan, Kubrick fan, or somewhere in between, or somewhere not at all. That's how I think you'll feel about The Shining sequel, and if it's worth watching. Well, why don't you go find out for yourself and come back to the comments, let me know. Was I right? Was I wrong? Who knows? And also check out some of the videos, why not? And you know what? Snap the like button. That's always a good time, right? I think so. Either way, everybody, this has been KenoKino. I am Keno, a month in the future from what you just saw, by the way. And, well, it's been a pleasure as always, and I'll catch you in the next one.